All right, we have a bunch planned tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and get started just with some logistical things. First off, it's really great to have everyone here. We have some great presenters tonight and facilitators. We're excited to see everyone. And thank you to the Education Organizing Committee, which is a crew of folks that are teachers and students and school board members that have really helped organize basically this whole event. And I'm just here to help facilitate. And my name's Alyssa Chen, and I work with the Education Justice Coalition of Vermont. So a few logistical things, just because we had a Zoom bomber in the past, we decided to kind of mute everyone's thing. If you do need to speak, you can raise your hand. And also later in breakout groups, everyone will be able to chat with each other. One other note is if you'd like to do live transcriptions, they are on, but you may need to turn them on for yourself. So if you go down to the bottom and see CC live transcriptions and hit that, it says show subtitles. So if you'd like to turn those on, you're welcome to turn those on. And we'll start with just a brief grounding to arrive here together. So folks just want to start with a breath, maybe shake your shoulders out a little bit. People are probably coming from the day, so maybe shake off some of the day. Take a deep breath and shake your shoulders, shake off some of the day and arrive here together. Take another couple deep breaths together. If you just want to notice or feel the ground under you, you can feel it at your seat. You might be able to feel it at your feet. Just kind of notice the earth coming up to meet and support you. All right, so to get us started, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the agenda. I'll be giving about a 10-minute or so PowerPoint presentation, just kind of sharing some updates and details of the COVID ESSER funding. And kind of the goal here tonight is just kind of get people updated about what's happening with the ESSER funding and how they can get organized locally. Then I'm going to pass it on to, oh, actually, I'm doing that second. First, we're going to pass it to Roderick and Deborah, who kind of get us grounded in why this mattered. And then I'll jump into a presentation. Then I'll pass it on to Amanda, who's going to help facilitate a panel, asking some really great questions about how do we organize around this and how we can make change locally. And we'll hear from a couple of folks that are doing that work. And then the last part of the presentation, we'll have about 20 minutes or so in small groups where folks can connect and start sharing about what they're doing locally and what seems to be working. And also kind of what they're planning to do or how they can imagine using what they're learning tonight locally. And then we'll end with some next steps. So to start out, and I'll kind of put this question in the chat. This is a question for Deborah and Roderick. We're just going to share a little bit about why this funding matters. Why are we here tonight? Why is it important to advocate for this? So the question for Deborah, if you want to share first, is why does this ESSER funding matter to you and your community? And if you want to share a bit about the needs of students in your community and highlight a few recommendations for spending if you'd like.
Okay, and I'm Deborah. I'm Deborah Lisi Baker, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of the Education Justice Coalition, but I'm also a disability activist and very active in the Vermont Coalition for Disability Rights, and work closely with the Vermont Center for Independent Living as well. And I guess I want to say that the ESSER funding is so important in part because we so rarely get money for schools that's over and above sort of the annual budgets. And this is money really that was intended to help communities and schools address the challenges that COVID has created, but also to do it in a transformative way and to make sure we don't leave communities that are often marginalized, including people with disabilities, BIPOC students and gay, lesbian, bi, trans students and their families behind, as well as immigrants and just a broad range of people who sometimes are the last people to be invited to help shape the community plan for making a more inclusive and effective school community. And so this is a real opportunity because the money's coming in over a 3-year period to use to really it requires schools to really reach out in a real way to have a real dialogue with people from diverse communities, diverse voices, including students, as well as caregivers and families and educators, to say, what is it that's going to make our schools work during this COVID pandemic, but also in other pandemics and in other crises that we may face, whether it's because of climate change or other challenges we face. What have we learned from COVID that we want to make sure we carry forward into the way we use funding for our schools in the future? So to me, it's a tremendous opportunity, both for us to be coming together from our diverse communities to say, how can we create something that works, that raises voices that haven't always been heard, so that they can truly transform both what it's like to be in school, what our after school programs are like, the whole virtual learning experience, as well as when people are able to be together in a physical classroom or outdoors. And for students with disabilities and their families, a key concern is that we maintain the civil rights protections that people fought so hard for, and that people are not having to risk their life or their child's life in order for them to be able to experience their right to a free public education. And so that means really best practices in terms of safeguards like masking and distancing and getting children vaccinated, but also allowing that option of online learning. In many ways, last year we were doing better. Right now, schools and educators are sort of being asked to figure it out locally, community by community. And we really need to find ways that we build some statewide commitment for supporting those local efforts and building the capacity to make sure that a school experience is a safe experience and a welcoming experience. And for me, as somebody who's a person with a disability and works with a cross disability community, that means I'm people with physical and sensory and mental health conditions and a broad range of intellectual disabilities, that we're really thinking about best practices. Somebody mentioned before we started the importance of universal design, how we bring in universal design into any of the solutions and strategies we're carrying forward with COVID. How do we really how do we raise up the voices of students with disabilities as with other students to really create the solutions that are built on the experiences and the strengths and hopes and of students from different backgrounds. And I wanted to make sure that people know that you can contact me. I'll put my email in, because the Vermont Coalition for Disability Rights really wants to know what is working and what isn't working for students with disabilities and their families. And I'm happy to follow up with anybody if you just email me. And I really, really appreciate hearing the stories of people from different communities about what works and what transformative work we can do together to make change.
Thanks so much, Deborah. We appreciate you and your wisdom. Thank you for sharing kind of why this work matters, particularly, I mean, for all of us, but especially for students with disabilities and their families. And next up, I'm going to invite Roderick up, who's an educator in the Northeast Kingdom, doing really great work up there in Orleans County. So Roderick, if you can also share just kind of to that question of like, why does this matter for you and your community, and what are some of the needs you're seeing for students?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. Once again, my name is Roderick Owens. I am an employee up in the Orleans Central Supervisory Union, as well as probably one of the newer members of the Education Justice Coalition, and as well as a community organizer, and we'll talk about that a segment later. But specifically, when we talk about this and the, and the ESSER funds, just as Deb said, it is Most definitely. Um, these are once in an once in a school term opportunities. Basically, they were funds that they weren't planning to basically budget into their normal daily operations for the school. So these funds became available, and they had specific guidelines. They were supposed to be primarily three areas: academic achievement, engagement, truancy, social, emotional, and mental learning. And these are things that basically all came about because of what we all experienced, when school shut down and everyone had to go remote. I know firsthand, how far, some of our students fell and, continue to fall, especially when I have to go home, or I don't understand why I have to wear a mask, and all of those types of things. And, the gaps and the disparities really shone through. Numerous organizations, even like the University of Vermont, did a great series, about how, resistance capital, and, how everything was affecting COVID, how COVID basically just showed a light on the extreme disparities, and as well as like the racial equity task force, the meetings that they were having and holding and trying to get, and realizing, oh, wait, now we have, telecommunications issues. Now we have internet connectivity. Now transportation. Oh my goodness. Now one parent has to go to work. There's nobody to watch the kid while they're trying to do the remote learning. All of those things and more basically can be addressed through this ESSER funding. So finding ways to engage your school boards and communities and all of that on how to spend this, because just as Deb said, it's a 3-year process, and the more we're engaged, the more ability we have to basically to control this funding.
Cool. Thanks so much, Roderick. We're happy to have you here. And we're going to hear from Roderick in the panel as well, since has his community organizer hat on. So I'm going to do a quick screen share here. And I tried to make a relatively brief PowerPoint that really got at some of the highlights and updates of kind of what's happening with all this money and funding right now. So here's the presentation overview. We're going to talk about what's with this money, just in a very general sense. The timeline, meaningful stakeholder engagement, and kind of what is that, what's expected, how to read a sample plan. I have a South Burlington plan that someone shared with me, so we'll look at that just to kind of see what parts we should be focusing on, and how to get involved and organize, which I'm not going to get way into because the panelists will get deeper into that than I'm able to. So what's with this money? There's 398 million coming in total, and it's coming in 3 pots of money: ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ARP ESSER 3. ESSER 1 and 2 came in kind of earlier, and a lot of it has already been spent and allocated. So we're actually focusing today mostly on ESSER 3 funding. And also ESSER 3 requires the greatest level of community input. So it's like the best chance for educators and students and parents to have a real voice about where this money's spent. And I'm from the Q&A is questions that folks asked before this presentation, but also feel free to put questions in the chat and we can try to answer those before the evening's done. The state receives ESSER funding based on the amount of their Title I funding, which is how many low-income students the district has. And you can see the amounts here. So let me actually pop this PowerPoint into the chat. And folks are welcome to, share this. It's not private material. This is for people to see and use. So if it's something that you want to share to your local group back home, you're welcome to use it. And then what's with this money about ESSER 3 in particular? And kind of folks have asked questions around, well, what is it supposed to be spent on? 20% of the money must be spent on specific things to help make up for learning loss experienced during COVID. The rest of the 80% of the money has quite a bit of flexibility and can be used for programs and services that address the academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs of all students, with a specific focus on the needs of historically marginalized students. And this is a timeline for ESSER 3, which unfortunately we keep kind of reaching out to the Agency of Education to try to keep this the most up to date. And we at one point had dates on here because I think it was supposed to be like August 30th, but they've given more time, and I think it kind of coincides with some federal deadlines and such. But so that's why there's a lot of these are kind of TBD. So district first receives funding in May 24th, 2021. Consultation with stakeholders is something that I think most districts are currently in process with. At some point, the plans will be due to the state. An additional public comment will take place, and plans must be posted on the website, which I believe a lot of districts have already done. And all these allocations, as kind of Deborah and Roderick has mentioned, it's a process. It doesn't have to get spent all at once. It has to be spent before September 30th, 2024. One of the requirements of the ESSER 3 funding is that there's meaningful stakeholder engagement. And we're kind of saying that that means more, going beyond a Google survey. So specifically with ESSER 3, consultation with educators, school staff, parents, caregivers, civil rights organizations, and stakeholders representing the interests of children with disabilities, English learners, children experiencing homelessness, children in foster care, migratory students, and children who are incarcerated, and other underserved students. Taking kind of from some language that the Agency of Education shared, meaningful stakeholder engagement should be inclusive, clear, effective, and ongoing in order to best support educational equity and excellence. And I want to emphasize that ongoing part, because although at some point these plans are due, there's a lot of language throughout ESSER that says that there can be ongoing input. And so if a plan is made and it's being implemented and it's not working, we can go back to the community, we can go back to school, and things can still be shifted. And also emphasizing that piece around it being inclusive, making sure there's access for everyone. From the Q&A, someone kind of asked about if the Agency of Education can force a certain type of representation on the ESSER districts teams. From what I understand, the AOE cannot require meaningful representation of most impacted communities on ESSER districts teams, but it can require outreach to those folks during the stakeholder engagement. And these are some resources, again, I think that PowerPoint's in the chat, that may be useful when you're thinking about pushing your district to make sure they're doing meaningful stakeholder engagement, as well as we've given a few tips in our toolkit, which I'll share that link as well. This is a sample recovery plan from South Burlington. There's a lot going on here and it's a little bit overwhelming to read. And I noticed, this is just kind of one tip from my experience of reading them, and other folks may have other tips around this, is that I really like looking at the further right-hand column first and really focusing on that. It says human resources and material required and how to pay for them. Because to me, this is really like what's being spent, what are we purchasing? And so in this example, if we look all the way to the left, South Burlington's trying to do some work around SEL and mental health and well-being. Well, what are they actually spending that on? Okay, they're getting SEL and mindfulness curriculum, schedule redesign to incorporate movement, mindfulness breaks throughout the day, professional development for both SEL, restorative practices. This all sounds like good stuff. And when I'm looking at it, I'm thinking of it kind of from an equity lens. So I'm thinking about, okay, movement and mindfulness breaks. How can these be accessible for all students that have different types of movement or may need different types of space to be mindful? Some students may need space on their own or different tactile objects. When I'm thinking about the mindfulness curriculum, I might bring a racial justice lens to think about how is a mindfulness curriculum trauma-informed from a racial justice lens. So that's really how I've been reading these. And folks in small groups may have other tips on that, but I really want to follow the money and think, okay, what is this really being spent on? And then trying to apply an equity lens to that. And you'll find here in the PowerPoint if you want to see the South Burlington example. And we're also working to put some plans on our website. So if you're from a school and you've seen your plan and you'd like it to be on our website, feel free to send that to us in the chat. So in terms of how to get involved and organize, we'll learn more about that in the panel, but here are some initial tips to think about. Gathering your team's the first great tip, making sure you have different representation, whether it be roles, identities, students, teachers, making sure you're hearing from various historically marginalized groups as part of your team. Contacting your superintendent can be a great next step, and gathering information so you have an understanding of what is your district's current plan, and also what is their stakeholder engagement plan. And then in terms of raising your voice, some things to advocate for is to advocate to fund resources and initiatives that support historically marginalized students and transform schools towards equity. advocating to go beyond a Google survey for community engagement, and advocating to build in a continuous improvement process. And this toolkit here has some other tips around community engagement and a sample letter that could be sent to the superintendent. And I'll just pop, that's our updated toolkit, and I'll pop this into the chat if folks want to take a look at that as well. It has a little more information. Yeah, and SEL, just to define that, is social emotional learning. So I'll stop the share here. And I think it's time, let me just double check the agenda here. I think it's time to pass it on to Amanda Garces, who's also a member of the Education Justice Coalition, who will kick us off on the panel. And thanks, Amanda, for supporting this piece.
Thanks, Alicia. Ooh, can you hear me okay? I'm so happy to be here. I have been just really excited about the opportunity to think about these funds in a more holistic way. So when I was reading about the community engagement piece, I was like, this is what we should be doing regardless of ESSER funding or not. So you saw a little bit of on the toolkit around gather your team. And you know, I was thinking like, it doesn't have to be our responsibility to gather all the team, but if you have a group of people that are like-minded, that you're like, we can affect some change, you can start by pushing or you know, advocating for these things to happen, because it's not necessarily, I think that we are in a movement where we need to think beyond what is happening right now. So like, what is it, if we're going to include community to think about ESSER funding, can we think about the long term? What if a district just like has this as the bottom, you know, the one of the holistic things that they do every year is to ensure that all those voices are included in everything. So I think I want to learn, we're gonna hear today from a community organizer, a teacher that's in a school district, and also from a school district that is looking at this ESSER funding. And I'm gonna just start by introducing our panelists, and then I'll throw some questions, but please feel free to, you know, teach us and inspire us to go and advocate to really have this money be used for transformation in our district. So I want to start by introducing Autumn Bangura. And hi, Autumn. And so Autumn will be talking. She's an equity director, and she will be I'm just gonna have you introduce yourself, Autumn, so that I don't mess up your titles.
Thanks, Amanda. So I'm here also with my colleague Sparks, who is the Director of Equity at the Burlington School District, but my official title is an Equity Instructional Leader. And I work in the Burlington School District Office of Equity. I use she, her pronouns, and I've had the honor to create something new. And I think that's why I was asked to be a panelist alongside my colleague Sparks. We created a Racial Justice Academy that was funded with ESSER funding that was attended by 51 middle and high school students last summer. So I can tell you a little bit more about that, but I'll let Amanda facilitate introducing the other panelists.
Great. We wanna, Sparks, would you like to? I have to find you. Where's Sparks? Is he here?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Sparks. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Sparks. I am the Director of Equity for the Burlington School District, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And then we're going to have Roderick as our other panelist. Do you want to quickly introduce your many hats?
Sure. Once again, my name is Roderick Owens, and actually, you want to talk about small worlds. I knew Sparks when he was Henry Sparks, and I was a freshman or sophomore in college down in Burlington, and he was, convincing me to help out with the Burlington mentoring program at Burlington High School way, way, way back then. So yes, I am still here, brother man. 30 years later, exactly.
Good
Exactly.
seeing you. Good seeing
Right?
you. Good seeing you.
Survival of the fittest. But part of being here as well is to highlight some of the work I've been doing in the Northeast Kingdom. As you guys know, the most, the hardest place in Vermont to live, to be a person of color, and the work that we've been doing with the equity team and basically pushing this to the forefront, and primarily with COVID funds, and having these conversations is how we kind of ended up here. So yeah, it's a 30-year story. So I'll get back to the panelists.
Right. Well, we're excited. I think what I wanted to do is look at it from all the different angles. One is, I would like to start with you, Roderick. How did you start your conversation in your district? How did you get your people? How did you start asking the questions as a teacher, as an educator, but also as a community organizer who's like really attached to the community on the day to day?
And thank you so much, because basically this kind of started up here in the Northeast Kingdom in like 2013. There was some racial graffiti put on the side of a barn, and a swastika and some other disparaging things, and basically a racial education and it was a work group, to start to analyze some of the equity issues that we had going on in the Northeast Kingdom. And different things kept coming up, and, different problems kept reemerging. So I was then working as an educator, but I still couldn't get the traction that I wanted, because I was part of inside of the system. And it's like, wait a minute, no, we keep talking about equity. We need a racial equity coordinator. Some of these issues aren't being addressed. What's going on? So this conversation started continuing on. And then basically really came to a head again last summer with George Floyd. And then where is everyone on their equity policies and things like that? And then therefore came out the ESSER funds. So during that time, though, I kind of figured out a way to get around the system. So it's like I'm not having any, I'm spinning my wheels at school boards, because they're only seeing me as an educator. So I literally stepped out of the group and started the Orleans County Coalition for Cultivating Equity, which is a community service organization, and became basically the managing member. And that way I was able to engage parents and children, of BIPOC parents and community members through that way, and through writing as well. And like the weekly newspapers appear, that gained support and momentum grew. And then as that grew and we started tackling these issues, it was, well, wait, how we can pay for some of these things? With ESSER funds.
And so that's I'll circle back to that. So I'll turn it over to Autumn and Sparks. Here you are in this district with this money. How did you come about the idea of creating your academy in this summer?
One of the things we have been struggling with, as somebody else on the call mentioned, is money, funding for schools. And really funding programs and projects that really empowered students of the global majority. So this is the first year that Burlington has really had an office of equity. And one of the first things we really wanted to do was to give students and create agency opportunities for students. In our school systems across the state of Vermont, we do a lot of talking about student voice, and I wonder if in most cases we really know what that means. Having students at a table, having a conversation is not empowering students and giving students agency to really change the school system and the structure of a school. So when we came up with the idea of the Racial Justice Academy, we really wanted to engage students in conversations around what was going on and what still is going on across our country as we think about white supremacy culture, racism, eradicating racism throughout our schools and in our schools. We also looked at what's going on nationwide as we think about the murder of George Floyd, and all the other things as we look at a school system around the Black Lives Matter movement. We wanted to give students an opportunity to really challenge us to really dismantle white supremacy culture and racism. So one of the things that we did find, be careful for what you ask for because you might get it. Our students really gave us an earful as to their experiences around racism, white supremacy culture, how they are being treated in our schools. And it was just a real opportunity for us to really hear firsthand from students, not only around the issues. The other part these students took the opportunity of doing was really giving us clear recommendations and strategies as to how we need to really change this system to really support students of the global majority. So we are really looking at moving the work forward as we really think about student opportunity and students really being a part of transforming our school system here in the Burlington School District. And I'm going to turn it over to Autumn.
Sure, thanks, Sparks. Well, I would say basically, when you look at equity really simply, you're thinking, okay, meeting the needs of all students in the educational context so they can thrive. And a lot of that has to do with reallocation of resources when it comes down to it, either human resources, financial resources, material resources. And so with this ESSER funding, I think it was like just a really promising way to think about like, okay, COVID impacted our schools. Burlington School District is one of the most diverse schools in the state. And so we already have a lot of needs in terms of students on IEPs, students on free and reduced lunch, and BIPOC students. So we understood the impact of COVID and how just like really reimagining and rethinking education and not going back to the norm. It was promising. As Roderick said, something about like re-envisioning or COVID highlighting all the disparities that were occurring. And I guess it was really promising because we just had a new superintendent. And with our equity and inclusion report, there were like these 6 goals. And many of these equity goals are like really driving our strategic planning. So when Sparks and I were like, hey, we want to do something completely outside of the box and create this Racial Justice Academy that's slated for BIPOC students in our district, but also to view them as consultants. Like they actually came, they were paid. They were youth and adult partners. And we are continuing the work even now. The students are being hired to actually conduct professional development workshops with teachers and staff and to serve on some district teams. So we're trying to kind of build this model of youth adult partnership and student leadership in our district so that, you know, nothing for us without us, that whole idea of students being at the table, but like real authentic engagement. I'm sending a link just because you can check that out later. There's some really cool videos and some slam poetry and capstone projects. I know Alyssa and Wifik came in from the Education Justice Coalition one day, but we also had a chance to, you know, put money in the pockets of BIPOC artists in the community, like Juniper Creative, and like visiting Clemens Family Farm and thinking about bringing all the students out of the city. It was a really incredible opportunity, and ESSER funding is going to fund it for another 2 years. So it's really promising to
That's
just kind of keep it going and see where it goes.
That is amazing. And I mean, I commend you for all the creativity and just like going outside the box. I think one of the things that we are seeing is that some of the districts are a little bit frozen with the idea of community engagement, the idea of like how to do something inclusive. What does it mean to pay the students? How to partner with the students? So I know that here at the Education Justice Coalition, we're always thinking on the intersectionality. We have our members who come from the disability rights movement. We have members who come from the LGBTQ community, and we're always thinking about like, how do we include? So in some of the districts, for example, the summer programming, you know, didn't really have things that could support some of the kids with disabilities, right? Like some of the families with disabilities. So like how are those things being thought about in your districts or in your communities? And what is the way for us to be able to like push forward. So I want to like hear from both a community organizer side and educator side, and from the administration side of like, here we have community members that are here to listen to you, to say like, how do we get through other districts that might not be as thoughtful and listening as you have?
I think one of the ways we do that, we have to be student-centered and thinking about students and the needs of students first. I also think as part of the money is slated for is to reach the most marginalized students. So how do we start to think when we have these resources to be as thoughtful and as inclusive as we possibly can? And I'm sure there's a lot of people on the call and throughout the state that have had ideas for ages and not had an opportunity of funding those things. So one of the things that we have really been focusing on in Burlington is listening to students and students telling us what they need and what they want. So as an example, another part of what we did with some of the funding was bought a lot of school supplies for students. We are looking at every opportunity that we can to hear directly from our marginalized students and their families, but also thinking about avenues that we have not thought about before as we think about students with disabilities, students of the global majority. And I think it also requires adults to be courageous, to be bold, and to push back, you know, to let schools know these are the things that students are telling us, and these are the things that we really know our students need. Because if we are not the ones leading and stepping up to really support the needs of our marginalized students, their needs go unmet.
Great. And Spark, how does that look like in practice? Like, what does community engagement look like? We are seeing a lot of just Google surveys. What else is there for districts to do that it's outside?
It's much more than a survey. As an example, the superintendent and I met with the group of African-American parents just yesterday to really hear from them. And by actually going to the community and not expecting the community to always come to us. So as Autumn was saying, we took a lot of field trips over the summer with our students to various places in the community to expose them to what's really going on outside of our district. School systems historically have always expected marginalized students to come to them. In a lot of instances, we should be going out to the communities. So one of the first things the Office of Equity did with our new superintendent and school board members, our leadership, we took them on a field trip to the Clemens Family Farm, to the Rokeby Museum and other places to really expose them to what's really out there as we think about racism and white supremacy culture. So we also need white people to really think differently and to really start exploring and challenging their own biases and how do they really start to help to support the needs of students and families of the global majority. But it really requires us to be courageous, to step up, and show out as we think about the real needs of students. And as Autumn had said, not for them, without them. So really listening to students and asking students the questions around their needs, because we cannot make assumptions, engaging, asking questions, and really being prepared to hear the ugly truth. And that was really a challenge for us, really hearing how students are experiencing education in Burlington. But what that does, it really gives us a framework and a foundation created by students, developed by students to really start to change our system. The other thing that happened from the capstone project and some of the recommendations from students, the superintendent opened school day with these students doing a presentation to all teachers district-wide. And that was the first time this district had really been led as far as opening day with a presentation from students of the global majority. And that was really well received and powerful.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Radha, you have insight for us?
I do, but only because we can take most of what Sparks said and then just put it in a capsule and say, well, what if there's only one person, one BIPOC person at one individual school, one K through 8 school, or if there's 8 schools in a school district, but there's literally a handful of BIPOC kids, scattered all around, and they're not really having any interaction with each other. That is a lot of what's going on in the Northeast Kingdom and in rural communities. And that's kind of, so one of the ways we've approached equity as well is like the rural equity question, telecommunications, internet, and transportation. Half the time you can't get to places. But that was actually one of the silver linings of Zoom and this, virtual world, is we've been able to connect with people across the state, just like now. Nobody had to drive, and we're safely in our semi-quarantined homes, right? Of course, I know. But that's the kind of work that's been happening. And one of the ways that, actually Sparks reminded me of, is starting last June, I basically started going to every single school board meeting. So, and as he knows, it's not necessarily a point of what the conversation is or what the discussion is. Once there's a Black person in the room, once there's a Black face in the room, the whole conversation shifts. And it's like, maybe we're focusing on a little, and we're focusing on equity. And that led to some work that the equity team was already doing. And because we're, literally up here fighting on some levels for survival. Because we can't get a racial equity coordinator. Like, we can't get the school board to afford it. And we said, well, there's ESSER funds. So those are the types of things that we are, a few steps behind because we don't have quite the population. But we're pushing those arguments, because, obviously it's needed the most up here. It's because we do feel like on an island. And at times it's like, well, let's get the same investment that's going on in Chittenden County up here in the rural, or out there in the rural communities, and we'll be able to do more. But it really does start with showing up and having access to these funds, because it's a once in a school time, 3 years, we might not get it again. And then there's programs, I know, because I've heard it on school board meetings, there's programs that they're going to fund with these ESSER funds. And at the end of 3 years, if they haven't figured out a way to fund them anymore, they're done, they're gone. So this is literally that time where we can do some level setting and make some big strides.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think that it's about what happened to our students before COVID, during COVID, and what's going to happen next, right? And I think that in Vermont, as you may know, we have proven disparities time after time for our kids with disabilities, our BIPOC kids, 2 to 3 times suspended, more likely to be suspended. Our students with disabilities and BIPOC students are 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspended and expelled than their white counterparts, for example, right? We know that our LGBTQ kids have a higher incidence of attempt suicide because they feel so unsafe in our school districts. So here, this is, in a way, this community engagement is about asking those families. I hear a lot about a student-driven, but also we kind of, in our conversations, sometimes forget the elementary school children and how they are unable. Well, they're unable because we don't let them, but they could go and advocate for themselves too. But like the power that parents group has in our districts, and in some of them, right? Like, and how to leverage those pieces of saying, hey, you are the parents group, they're in some that have like the traditional PTA, mostly are there to fundraise, but it could have another purpose. So I know that in Montpelier School District, and this is not a hat I'm wearing today, but I am a school board member there, and I'm also a parent, very involved parent with the we renamed it Caregivers Alliance instead of the parents group to be more inclusive. And that's like some of the work that we're doing, is like pushing for like these conversations to happen. It's hard to wear 2 hats, so sometimes that gets a little, I'm not able to do this, but I'm able to do that. But if you have community members that are doing some of that work, that's really important. So Here's a question from Liz. How does the Education Justice Coalition build its impact through alliances with other organizations like ACLU, Up for Learning, Vermont After School, to get involved in the ESSER strategic planning discussions? Alisa, do you want to answer that?
That's a good question. I mean, it makes me think, oh, we could probably do a better job is what I'm thinking initially. But yeah, I think that one thought I have too is like leveraging some of these organizations around stakeholder input, particularly, if that makes sense. And so some of these organizations, specifically like Vermont Center for Independent Living, for example, that serves and supports students with disabilities, around pushing the school districts to talk to folks there to see like what's needed for students with disabilities. So I think that would be one way to connect with some of these statewide organizations, specifically ones that are representing certain constituencies. And yeah, I don't know if you want to add that, Amanda.
I would add that so when the toolkit was developed, it's like these questions around like, who's in your community? That's really the important piece of it. So like, we know we have statewide organizations, and maybe we can add that to the toolkit at a later time. The statewide organizations that really work with our group. So we have Outright, we have Vermont Center for Independent Living, that really are already organized, that have the groups that it's like as simple as like, who do you have? You know, Outright has all the groups that are in the schools. It's like, who do you have? How do we get involved with your community? And it's as simple, they are already organizations that are embedded in your community. It's basically going and say like, we together, so it's like, we need to go and push. Because again, it's about that local control that Vermont loves so much, right? Like we are our local. So in a city like Burlington versus city of Montpelier is much easier. Northeast Kingdom also has a rich number of organizations and nonprofit that exists, maybe not related to education, but that do work with people. So that is something that we need to do. Maybe not the coalition, but if there is a group that wants it, we can support and being able, like, let's connect and get that group together. I think that one of the things that we are seeing is that the challenge is that there's a little bit of a lack of clarity on timelines from the state of Vermont because of the federal. So I know like right now for the requesting the money for the ESSER 3, they're kind of waiting for the federal to approve the statewide budget that the Agency of Education submitted. So that's kind of like in the process. And once they say go, then they go back to the school district to say, okay, here's your deadline. But many of the districts are already ahead saying we did community engagement, which was the survey, a Google survey. And many of them asked for demographic questions. Some others didn't. So we don't know what's going to happen once they submit that and say, well, we did our outreach and 10 people showed up, because that's what's going to happen, right? If we don't push. Deborah, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to add in response to Liz's question. There are members of the Education Justice Coalition who sit on some of these other groups. There's a Vermont Equity Working Group that's co-sponsored by the Vermont Children's Voices for Vermont Children and the Public Assets of Vermont. And but I think that what some of the other groups that like Up for Learning and Vermont After School, what they need is to hear from those community organizers in different parts of the state, so that there's more BIPOC and diverse, often marginalized communities that are building partnerships with these other groups, so that when a school district says they're going to do a contract for a particular service, they're looking at making sure it's a really inclusive model, and that the people who are doing the work, whether they're students or professionals or community members, represent the diverse community and bring those voices and experiences to the after-school programs and to the peer support programs. mental health, for example, was a huge issue for students before COVID. We hear about it now because of COVID. It's a huge issue. The data around depression in Vermont for children and young adults has been bad for years, but we need the types of models and approaches where youth are part of shaping peer support for students in their schools, and that the voices of people from those different diverse communities are part of shaping the models and approaches and the support that's given. So I think it's a collaboration. I do think we need to be working with the other groups, and they need to be working with the communities that the Education Justice Coalition represents, and so some of these the speakers on the panel represent, so that we're creating a much more true representation of Vermont experience that's really inclusive. And this is, again, I think the ESSER fundings are a perfect time for that work.
And Roderick, you have your hand, you want to say, come, share. Autumn, you're being quiet. You have insights for us?
I'm here. I just wanted to mention one thing. You did say something about disability advocacy. And while this isn't related to ESSER funding, it was something that I was really proud that Burlington School District did in the fall of 2020. There was a hybrid model of 4 days a week of school, but students on IEPs and EL students attended all 4 days. And I thought, wow, that's just such a concrete model of like adding a little bit of extra seat time for those students, a little consistency. So I'm really proud of that basic decision. But I also just wanted to say, beyond the Racial Justice Academy, we're really dedicated into continuing our restorative practice work in our district. And so we're using the ESSER funding to secure restorative practices specialists. Their new positions, which it's my hope, Sparks, that after these 2 years go, that we'll have so much data and we'll be able to really show the impact so that it becomes permanent. That's really I think that's where the new advocacy comes in. When this funding dries up, we're like, hey, we did this. We tried it with this funding. It's so critically important to have these restorative practice specialists in the schools to avoid what Amanda was mentioning about exclusionary, disciplinary practices that are punitive and skewed and biased. So we've done that, and we're in the process of hiring a re-engagement coordinator to really look at the myriad of reasons why students are disengaged and to remove those barriers and come up with some alternatives, restorative practice circles with families to talk to them and think about how to get those students back into school.
Amazing.
And I did actually want to add, there's two things I would want to add. When we're talking specifically about the Northeast Kingdom and allyship and potential resources, starting last summer, it really did start with 3 parents getting together and writing a letter about, the equity statement that OCSU had put out, quite honestly being not enough. I mean, and really all they had to say was Black Lives Matter, and move along. But they wanted to come out with an equity statement, and it wasn't that strong, and it kind of disavowed the work that had been done, but that kind of started a maelstrom of letters to the editor and letters to the Chronicle, and back and forth. So we were able to engage a lot of, I say, octogenarians that are reading the papers and writing, and they're, and then they see me middling around, in the community, and it's oh, wow, I read what you wrote. That's really awesome. Thank you. But also parents, started to align their kids, with me as well. So the community started to grow exponentially from that, from having kids engage and having kids willing to be a part of the process. And, so therefore, Old Stonehouse Museum up in Brownington. And just like you were saying, Sparks, you take them to the Clemens Farm and then the Rockaby Museum, then the next thing you have to tell them about is Alexander Twilight. And then from that aspect, now we have a story where we're framing, see what happens when we promote equity, see what happens when we include everyone. The whole program can grow and expand itself. And that's kind of where things are going. And then more allies are showing up, more, white allyship is helping the cause up here. And we've recently, attracted some attention from Chittenden County. So we're working on things now to help us with like Russ Ingalls and a few other people. So no, that's how, momentum starts. And that's how, ESSER funds can be applied, to basically educate schools on Twilight or on other social emotional learning and things like that. And then I did want to say, especially as part of this process, transparency is something that all the school districts are really after and working on. So all of these plans are being put up on their websites, and they're hoping you don't go and see them. I mean, really, they're really hoping, oh, well, we put the link up and nobody went. We put the form up and they'll tell you, oh, in an equity team meeting, well, we put the form up, Rod, but nobody signed up for it. Nobody did it. All right, that's fine. I'll get 10 parents to fill it out for you, okay? And we'll move on. But for instance, I spent most of the day comparing like South Burlington's to like Oxus. And it's literally, you have to play around a little and get in the financial, like be a forensic accountant, because I'm reading like Oxus and it's like, 6 interventionists for the elementary and middle school, $551,600. 5 interventionists for LR, Lake Region Union High School, $443,900. The facts are community members and stakeholders, we're engaged to go back in a year from now and be like, so you hired those 6 people, how did it work out? Did you spend all that money? How much of that money is left? Or what, you never actually hired for somebody because you complain that you can never get good qualified candidates. So that money stayed in the pool. Where did it go then? I mean, it's literally that much fun to find ways to help them support equity in your school district.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, and we're gonna wrap up to go in small groups. So in a few minutes, I think that the question, if you are a community member, the questions that you have to ask is like, who are they talking to? And can I be part of that group? Or if they're not talking to anybody, should I be starting a group that's gonna look at these things? Unfortunately, that is the work that we're gonna have to do to make sure that, everybody is listened to. And I think that in many districts, all of the districts, I know that educators are going through a lot. We support educators, we also want to hear their voice. Educators and students both know exactly what the needs of their students are. They are the ones that are there day to day. And being able to see that reflection into the budgets or into the strategic plan of the districts, into how they're going to, being able to see, okay, you really engage your educators as well as your students and as well as your parents. That reflects, this is the reflect. Like, I know in some of the districts, people are saying that there is a lot of mental health support that is needed. So is moving that forward. And if you want to organize, we're here for you. I think that there's really a few questions you need to ask yourself. Is like, who lives here? And who is doing some work? And where do people go? So in Montpelier, I give you the example. We have the teen center, we have the senior center, who are, always like very involved. We have our recreation department. We have our coffee shops. We have, like where flyers can happen. We have our LGBTQ groups, the student groups that are inside. So I think starting to be able to ask the questions is like how we can take this ESSER funding out and say, hey, let's support this that is needed. So I'll give it up a one round, including Deborah, because Deborah is I just always so wise. And so if you want to just finish up, do a little circle of last thoughts before we go into small groups. I will start with Autumn, who's next to me.
No, just I appreciate your advocacy, and I appreciate what Amanda said in terms of like, think about who is missing and whose voices needs to be included. And don't forget about students. They're the ones we're doing this work for. So that's the most important piece.
I guess I'll just add that I think that it, all evening I've been thinking about who is missing and how do we bring them into the conversation and into the work. But also think about what's happening in your community and how some of these transformative funds can be used in ways that may be possible because of emerging things that are happening. For example, in my school district, they're literally planning a new school building, and all kinds of things happen in terms of creating spaces for conversation and dialogue, places where people can get their special education services in a space that's designed to promote learning and to not feel exclusionary, and thinking about the air quality of buildings and spaces if we're thinking about really addressing some of the health issues that have come up with COVID. But you know, for me, what happens is just to hear what each of the panelists have said and how powerful that reflects real transformative work that's going on in the community that we can continue and support each other in doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, I was muted. Sparks?
The only thing that I would add, I would like to just kind of echo what Autumn was saying about students. Bringing students and families in a meaningful way. We are, as school systems, we are good at saying we had students at the table, parents at the table. That does not mean that we had them at the table in a meaningful way where they are partners. So one of the things we really wanted to do with the Racial Justice Academy was look at students as equal, students as decision makers. So in this, especially as we think about marginalized student groups, not only having them a part of a conversation as to how we disperse funds, how are these funds going to be used in a meaningful way to really serve and benefit their needs?
Yes. Thank you. Roderick?
Exactly. And in that same tone, I would echo some of the discoveries that I've made over the last couple months, is realizing that, you know, administrators are human beings too, as well as school board members. And we're all, you know, carrying around our luggage with all of the things that we're trying to work on. So especially right now, like these ESSER funds are sliding right in there with the equity teamwork that's going on. And basically, if all the equity teams and the equity, and we're focused on equity and the ESSER funds and the administrations and the school boards all work together, we can finish this anti-vax, this anti-CRT, this anti-Trump stuff. We can get it all behind us and move forward together, because they need allies too.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much. And I think this is great just to learn from all the amazing things that you guys are doing and all the work that you're pushing. And I hope that we can continue working together in so many things. And then I'm gonna turn it over to Alisa.
Well, so let's give the panelists some love or some reactions, some celebration. Woo! So we're gonna spend it'll be more like 15 to 20 minutes, somewhere between then, in small groups. We're going to be kind of breaking out by school. I'll open the breakout rooms in a minute and just sharing around introductions, and then 2 key questions, just sharing out what are things that folks in your district have done to organize around this issue, and then sharing out what are the things you could imagine to organize around this issue. So I'll put in the facilitation plan here, tried to make it relatively simple. Then I'm going to open up the breakout groups. If you go to the bottom right hand corner, you will see the breakout rooms, and you'll see them kind of organized by school. So try to find your school and pop into there. And if you don't see your school, you can just wait a minute and kind of join one that needs some space. And if you're having trouble joining, just let us know in the chat where you'd like to go. So go ahead and pop in a room. Again, the bottom right-hand corner, those 4 squares, if you hit those, you should be able to hit join for a room. I see folks going in, which is great. And then just chat us up if you want help going to a room. Hey, Chloe. I'm gonna ask like a couple folks just to share out what they're taking away from today, and so if you can help with making people co-host so they can unmute. Cool. So it'd be great to hear from some folks maybe that we haven't heard from in the full group, just with anything that you're taking away from today. It could be from the conversation you just had, it could be from one of the resources shared, it could be from the panel, but it'd be awesome to just hear briefly from maybe 3 people or so of like, what's something you're kind of taking away or thinking about as you're leaving this session. And you can just kind of raise your hand and Chloe will help unmute. Cool, I see Angela there.
Unmute magic. Well, I will say I'm taking away from our group and Amanda specifically that there can be, how do I want to say, like a payoff to persistence, and that I'm grateful to Amanda for the reminder that I'll just say that there can be a payoff to persistence, and that receiving, pushback and being told no a lot it doesn't mean you have to listen to that or take that as the answer. And that if you are willing to, especially if you're willing to put forth the energy, the what I call the activation energy, and be that motivator, there's a lot of power in that. So I just want to honor Amanda for that and say thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Angela, for sharing. I appreciate that and appreciate your wisdom, Amanda. Yeah, if there's 2 more folks that want to raise their hand or just unmute and kind of share one thing you're kind of taking away or thinking about today, it'd be great to hear from some other folks.
I will dance if you guys don't.
Anyone else want to share any? Yeah, Deb, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just incredibly inspired. And I just can't wait to learn how to be a better organizer. I'm really good at the connecting piece. Yeah, I'm so incredibly inspired, and I can't wait to get organized with other folks. Thank you.
Awesome. Great to hear from you, Deb. And is there anyone else that wants to share? You can just kind of go ahead and unmute. While we're waiting, in case anyone wants to share, I'm going to pop this survey into the chat, and it's super helpful to hear from folks as we kind of reflect on this event and think about planning our next event. And we don't have specific plans yet for a date, but we're hoping to do something kind of targeting actually kind of districts and school leaders, really thinking about how to gather community input. So look forward to that. And we're also kind of in another group, you can look forward to this too, is working on a Police Set of Schools toolkit that we're really excited about, that will have kind of video and interactive pieces to share. So all sorts of work happening, and appreciate everyone coming out tonight. If people want to unmute themselves as they're going and say goodbye, however they like to say goodbye, it's great to hear everyone's voices. And thanks for coming out, and feel free to share your contact in the chat too if you like. It's always like great to come out to these to learn, but also really to connect. So super valuable. And thanks to all the panelists and Chloe for the tech support. Yay.
Yay. Thank you, everyone. And yes, we are here to support you and all your endeavors. So please let us know how to support and how to come to you. And thanks, Sparks and Autumn and Roderick and everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Pleasure meeting everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
You
Thanks,
too.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Hi, Stefaker. Nice to be at the pool.
I have to put my school email in there as well because I forget to use that one too.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's like,
All right, we did it. Yay.